And so you see how God is never embarrassed to have His people on display in the middle of Moab and take everything from them. And everyone around there knows that they call Yahweh Lord. And this Yahweh that's supposed to be Lord of all has taken everything that they've got. So the name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi. We might know that name to mean sweet. There's probably a footnote in your Bible saying that's the name of, or the meaning of the name Naomi is sweet or pleasant. And the name of his wife Naomi, the names of his two sons were Mahlon and Chilion. Mahlon and Chilion are both close derivatives of words that mean something close to puny and piney. Now, that explains something to us of the foolishness of Elimelech's decision to go to Moab, because anybody who would decide to name his sons puny and piney, it's not surprising at all to us that he would decide to go to Moab in a famine. So, you can just imagine the scenario. The firstborn son is there and the nursemaid comes. You're the father of a baby boy. Let's name him Puny. And then let's name the next one Piney. But as it all works out to be, they of course prove themselves to be puny and piney as they die in young age. So we're told next that they were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. Now Bethlehem, the city of Bethlehem, previously to being known as Bethlehem, was known as Ephrathah. So we see there the root of Ephrathites. So this tells us that they were Bethlehemites or Ephrathites long before. They weren't newcomers. That was where their clan, that was where their family had its roots for generations and generations and generations. So they were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. Did you catch the subtle change in language? Because in verse 1, it's described to us that they went to Judah, or they went in Judah over to Moab to sojourn. You know what that word sojourn means? That word sojourn specifically means to go to a place temporarily, to go to a place for a time. A sojourner is one who has gone into a foreign land for a temporary period of time. So they go to Moab to sojourn, but the very next verse is they remain there. They live there. So as they're leaving, we can just hear the conversations. Elimelech is saying to mom and dad, don't worry, we're going to ride this famine out in Moab 3 months, 4 months, 6 months tops. We'll be back within 6 months. Don't worry, this isn't goodbye. We'll just be back in just a few months. We're going to ride out the worst part of this. We'll get some food over there in Moab. We'll be back. This will even help you because there'll be less mouths here to feed. The food here is so limited, you'll have to stretch it less. So we'll just go here just for a short time, and then we'll be back. Little did he know he would never see Israel again. Little did he know that he would spend the rest of his life in Moab, because that is the nature of sin. The departure from the land of promise to flee the famine into the land of the idolatrous Moabites is seen as sinful in the Old Testament context. And so that is the nature of sin. Sin always, it's been said, sin always takes you farther than you wanted to go, keeps you there longer than you wanted to stay, and costs you more than you wanted to pay. I don't know who first coined that phrase. The first time I think I've seen it was from the lips of Ravi Zacharias. But a number of people have used that phrase because it's so helpful, because it is so true. Sin takes you farther than you wanted to go. It keeps you there longer than you wanted to stay. And it costs you more than you wanted to pay. That's the nature of sin. Elimelech takes his family to Moab thinking we're just going to be there a short time, only to find out he will never leave. Some of you here today may have an experience in your life in which you said, I'm just going to dabble with this sin just one time, just to see what it's like. I'm just going to test the waters. I'm just going to stick my toe in the waters and then I'm done with it. And now it's a decade later and you find that you cannot leave it. That's the nature of sin. It always is consuming. It always is overtaking and overwhelming, and it will always take you down that path further than you planned to go. Elimelech never planned to live in Moab. He just planned to go there and ride out the worst part of the storm of the famine. So they went to the country of Moab and they remained there. Also, we see here not just the nature of sin, how sin has drug Elimelech and his family into this context in which he never leaves and his sons never leave, but also we see something here of the futility of the human solution to the problem. The human solution is, well, let's go over there. There's food in Moab. And yes, God has told us to have nothing to do with those people. But you know what? There's food there and there's not food here. Now again, we look at this carefully because we weren't there. Our children weren't crying. We weren't looking at empty cupboards. We weren't looking at dry, dusty fields. And so we don't know firsthand what it was like. We don't even know what a famine was like. And so therefore we're careful in passing judgment. As Jesus will say, we recognize the log in our own eye before we recognize the speck in Elimelech's eye. But nonetheless, don't we still see something of the futility of the human solution? I've got a plan. Now we don't know whose plan it was. Maybe it was Naomi's plan. We're never told. Maybe it was Naomi who nagged Elimelech into going. And every night she would say, you know, the babies are crying. I don't have anything to give them, Elimelech. I've got nothing to give them. We've got no hope here. Let's go there. And maybe Elimelech was the one who delayed as long as he could, and finally he couldn't delay any longer. Or maybe it was Elimelech as the leader of that patristic family who said, this is what we're doing, and Naomi had no voice in it. We don't know. But in either case, we see the futility of saying, I will take matters into my own hand. Reminds us of how the whole nation began, didn't it? As Abraham was promised the promised child, and yet the child wasn't coming. Let me help God out just a little bit. I've got an idea. We can do this thing with our servant, and we will help God along. You see the futility of the human wisdom there. So he goes there into Moab, and he remains there. Now verse 3. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died. Another tragedy. You see how we're just in verse 3. And how the tragedies are stacking one upon another. One upon another. We live in a sinful age. Now we're under the judgment of God. In our sinfulness, we have gone to this wicked, idolatrous land. And now, the biggest weight of all, the biggest tragedy of all, Naomi finds herself husbandless. Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. If we were Naomi, we would probably be saying to ourselves right about now, it can't get any worse than this. You think that you might have said that to yourself? It just can't get any worse than this. We have not had food. We have not had fellowship with God. We're out of the land of promise. I haven't seen my family in years. We live among these Moabite people. And now, my husband's gone. You see, it can always get worse. It can always get worse. And there is no promise. There is no promise. Whatever situation you face, there's no promise that you've seen the worst of it. There's no promise that God's working in that situation has reached its apex. And so there's no reason for Naomi to say, we just speculate, but it seems to make sense to me that she would say, what could possibly happen that's worse than this? But maybe she does look at the bright side. Now she's husbandless in the ancient world, which is dramatically worse than being husbandless in the modern world. She finds herself husbandless, but at least she can say, I've got my 2 sons. I at least have my 2 sons. And in this day and in this age, that meant that she would be cared for. She had 2 men who, upon reaching adulthood, would care for her. And then there was the hope. Well, there'll still be grandchildren. There's still life. There's still hope. This is an awful, tragic period of my life. I have no idea why God is doing this. But at least things can get better because, there'll be weddings to come. There'll be some grandchildren to come. I have that to look forward to. Verse 4. These took Moabite wives. The next tragedy. These Moabite wives that are worldwide known as the whores of the ancient world, as the sexually deviant of the ancient world. And they take wives from among the Moabites. Not just one, but both of them. So the next tragedy compounds upon her life. And so now she has a life to look forward to of two daughters-in-law who come over to her house to sit at her table, to eat under her roof, who are of these kinds of people. It's not bad enough that I live among these people, but now they're part of my family. They took Moabite wives. If only your father was here. If only Elimelech was still here, this never would have happened. These took Elimelech wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. Ruth is a derivative of a word that means something like friendship. And so we'll see that play out as we go along. They lived there about 10 years. And both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her two sons and her husband. Now the tragedies are complete. In 5 verses, we have witnessed a decade of tragedy upon tragedy upon tragedy upon tragedy. The author narrates it in this staccato-like style, just one right after the other. No explanation, no reason, just boom, 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 boom. Much like Job. You remember the story of Job, how the tragedies of Job are just narrated in such blunt, quick fashion. There's the losing of the animals, the losing of the crops, the losing of his family. Boom, 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 and then the losing of his health. Much the same thing here. Tragedy, 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 tragedy. Finally, the tragedy of all tragedies. The only two that she had left to care for her, to provide for her. Now they die, so that the woman was left without her two sons and without her husband. You ever been in that place, or maybe you know some people who are in that place, who reach a point in life in which they say, this is just not how I thought things would end. This is just not how I thought my life would turn out. This is just not how I pictured the golden years of my life. This is just not how I pictured retirement. I pictured retirement as reaching that point in which I can stop working and do some things and go play some golf and go drink these little drinks with these little tiny umbrellas while I lay in a hammock and maybe go tour the U.S. or go tour the world or whatever. I didn't plan on this disease. I didn't plan on this cancer. I didn't plan on this happening to my spouse. This is not the way I thought that my golden years would end. Naomi is in such a position as this. But notice with me that both Mahlon and Chilion died, so the woman was left without her two sons and her husband. I wonder if you can think with me, just something, about what the neighbors in Moab thought of Elimelech and his family. Just think about this. Think about the testimony to the Moabite people of this one Israelite family living among them. Imagine you're this Moabite people, and here's this one family of Israelites. They come and they're living among you, and they've got this strange God. Your God demands child sacrifices, and you have this multitude of gods and all this pantheon of idols that you worship and everything. And they, through their false idolatry, they promote sexual promiscuity and all these kinds of wickedness and everything. But these Israelites, you know that they come from a context in which their God is very different. They believe in one God. And they believe that one God is God over everything, not just over this area of life or that area of life or whatever it may be. And they are these people, they call themselves the people of the covenant. And they claim that this God has written down things for them. So I wonder what these kind of people are like. I wonder what their God is like. Let's watch them. Let's watch how their God treats them. Oh, wait a minute. Why are they even here? They're here from the land that their God supposedly gave to them because their God wasn't feeding them there. And what's more, wait a minute. The father is dead. What kind of God does that? And now the two sons are dead. Do you get a flavor of what the Moabite idolatrous people must have thought of such a people who claim to know the one true living God? Would you not have thought that if God wanted a powerful witness among the Moabites, what would He have done? But heap blessing upon the one Israelite family among them. And yet what God does is the very opposite. You see, this points us to something that is a crucial and important and widespread mistake that is made today in Western Christianity, and that is the false belief that God desires to be glorified among non-believers by means of His material blessings to believers. That is a widespread lie that Christians promote, that somehow God desires glorification on the part of non-believers because He has blessed His people materially so much. Nowhere in Scripture is that truth borne out. Nowhere in Scripture do we see ever God desiring to have non-believing people look at just how He heaps material blessings onto His people, and then the non-believers say, wow, that God, they really got it going on. Their God is really giving them the stuff that we like. We ought to think about going over to that God. That's not how the economy of God ever works. Here's how God wants to receive glory from non-believers. He wants to receive glory from non-believers because His people may sometimes experience material blessings, may sometimes experience famine, but whatever they experience, they still glorify Him. That's how He desires to see glory. He desires to be glorified when His people see Him as more precious than possessions or lack of possessions, than money or lack of money, than health or sickness. Regardless, this is how God desires to be glorified. Philippians 4, 12 and 13. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. I can do all things through Him who strengthens me. Or Job 13 and verse 15, though He slay me, I will hope in Him. The same sort of thing is communicated Psalm 84 verse 10. For a day in your courts is better than 1,000 elsewhere. So many other places we could see this same principle. Sometimes God will bring material blessings to His people. Sometimes He will withhold them. Sometimes He will take His people into the depths of poverty. Sometimes He will take everything from them. Sometimes He will give them everything. Never is He doing that for the purpose of other people seeing how He treats His people and say, I want some of that. Instead, what He desires is for the non-believing world to see that and see the hope that lies within them. The precious hope that lies within them, that regardless of how this life treats them, their hope is still in Him. And so you see how God is never embarrassed to have His people on display in the middle of Moab and take everything from them. And everyone around there knows that they call Yahweh Lord. And this Yahweh that's supposed to be Lord of all has taken everything that they've got. God's never embarrassed about that. He's never ashamed of how others may look upon His people's poverty, His people's lack, His people's hardships. God's never embarrassed for others to look upon that and say, their God has allowed them to go to a dark place. Their God has taken them to a place of suffering. Their God has taken them to a place of loss. But regardless, they still hope in Him. You see, that's the more powerful testimony. And that's the testimony that Elimelech's family are giving to those around them. Now verse 6, and she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited His people and given them food. Take note there of where Naomi hears of God's moving. It's been more than a decade. And what has God been doing? Has God just been quiet? Has Naomi cried out to God and He's been silent through the first tragedy, the second tragedy, the third tragedy, the fourth tragedy, over and over? All these things keep happening and she just feels cold and distant, and yet she's in the fields of Moab when she hears that God has visited His people. You ever been there? You ever been in the fields of Moab? When tragedy after tragedy has struck your life and you feel like that there's been 3 tragedies in a row and God has been silent through all of them, it may just be that you are not yet to that tragedy at which He will speak, at which He will then say, now, my child, now you're ready for me to work with. Now you have reached the point that you are ready to receive what I have to teach you. You weren't ready on tragedy number 2. You weren't ready on tragedy number 3, but now you're ready. So she hears in the fields of Moab, and what does she hear? That the Lord had visited His people and given them food. That's the first occurrence of the covenant name of Yahweh there, all capitals, Lord. So the great I am, the I am that I am, has visited His people and He has given them food. That is something that is so easy for modern people to overlook. That God has come and given His people food. Because again, the disconnect that exists in the modern world, I think, is probably the most lamentable disconnect that exists in the economy of God's family. There are many things that our modern world brings to us in terms of benefits that we are thankful for. I'm thankful for modern medicine. I'm thankful for things like air conditioning. I'm thankful for transportation. I'm thankful for a lot of things in our modern world. But all of those things, every one of them, comes with a cost. And I think that the modern convenience that comes with the highest spiritual cost is the modern convenience of the supermarket. Because I think that is the strongest disconnect that exists in the mind of the modern day Christian. That every bit of that food in the supermarket came directly from God. Because we walk in the supermarket, and it's hard, isn't it? To walk and you see the boxes of Cheerios, and you see the boxes of pancake mix that I had to run out and get this morning because I ran out of pancake mix here. But I went to the Food Lion, and guess what? There was a whole shelf of pancake mix. Shelves of pickles, peanut butters, jellies, bread, meats. It's all there. And that's so easy to walk in there and just think, this stuff is just here. It's here because the supermarket's selling it. Now, we don't go so far as some of those young people that we see today. You see the crazy videos where young people think that the supermarkets make the food. And there's this disconnect between the farmer and the supermarket. We know that that's not true. But isn't there still that disconnect between the supermarket and God? Isn't there still that disconnect where it's so easy to just think that you have food because you remembered to go grocery shopping? Because you got your paycheck this week and you went to Food Lion and you stocked up on what your family will need this week, and that's why you have food? It's an easy thing to lose sight of. This is one of the reasons that we prioritize fellowship meals. This is one reason why the fellowship meal that we have before every service is not something that we treat as optional. It's not something, we don't want you as part of the covenant family of God to think that that's something that you come to when you're hungry. We want you to think of that as a non-optional part of the family of God because it does a number of things. Number one, it emphasizes table fellowship. It emphasizes genuineness of fellowship. And number two, it reminds us twice a week that God abundantly blesses us, and we can see it right here. We can smell it right here. We can taste it right here because God provides this for us each and every time. That's a disconnect that the Christian must work hard today to reestablish. When you walk in the grocery store, you should proactively think to yourself, God, thank you for these Cheerios because you brought them to me. Thank you for these eggs because you created the chickens that laid these eggs. People may have harvested them and put them in the little containers, and trucks may have brought them to the grocery store, and cashiers check them out for you, but God brought you those eggs. That's a connection that's important for us to protect.